Before we get into the intro, I want to ask you the most important question, which is
Yes.
what is your hair care routine? I mean, being in your 40s, having hair like that is proof of God's existence. Tell us, how do you do it?
I do think God resides in my hair. Yeah, I wish I had a sophisticated hair care routine. I probably would benefit from one, but I say like only in the past couple months have I actually started brushing my hair when when like dreadlocks started forming and I had to like sort of peel out these dreadlocks and I was like, "Oh," and then someone told me, "Yeah, like you brush your hair when you're in the shower." And I was like, "Yeah, that's a lot easier." And so, yeah, I sadly don't have a very sophisticated hair care routine.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back to Technically Friends, the only podcast where Silicon Valley meets actual feelings. And responsible innovation means thinking before we build the robot overlords. I'm Timothy Reuter, joined by my co-host Harrison Wolf, and we're really excited about today's conversation. As always, we wanted to find a way to highlight the amazing people we've met throughout our careers. Today's guest is a person who dances between the spiritual and the technological. He was the first ever director of responsible innovation at Meta, where he told Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp to maybe, just maybe, not break society this week. He's advised TikTok, Google, Airbnb, and Pixar, which means he's helped everyone from teenagers dancing on the internet to sentient toys in existential crisis. He previously served on the executive committee of the World Economic Forum, where he launched the Centers for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in 13 countries, working with governments, companies, and stakeholders from around the world to accelerate the adoption of new technologies in the global public interest. Most importantly, this is where the three of us got to know each other. Prior to that, he was at the U.S. State Department as their first ever ambassador to Silicon Valley. We work with the technology and innovation sectors on tackling global challenges and planning for the international impacts of emerging technology. Zvika is now rabbi of Chochmat Halev, a progressive spiritual community in Berkeley, California, for embodied prayer, heart-centered connections, and mystical experiences. So buckle up, breathe deeply, and prepare to have your chakras aligned and your algorithms questioned, because today we're going to be talking about AI, God, violence, Judaism, and much, much more with Zvika Krieger. Zvika, welcome to the show.
It's so good to be here with you guys.
So to kick things off, I want to start with going pretty far back in your life, which is when you were at yeshiva. How did studying Aramaic and Talmudic law prepare you for looking at the ethical implications of technology at places like Meta?
It's a really good question, and maybe there's like a few different ways that I can answer that question, perhaps in some surprising and unsurprising ways. For those of our listeners who don't know what a yeshiva is or what Talmud is,
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So
Zvika.
yeshiva is like a Jewish house of study. And you know, or you could sort of call it like a seminary, a religious school. And I grew up Orthodox, which is like on the most conservative end of the religious spectrum, or most traditional end of the religious spectrum in Judaism. And it's pretty common in that community for people to spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day in yeshiva studying Jewish texts and Jewish wisdom. And so I did that throughout my elementary, middle school, high school years, and then went off to Israel after high school, before college, to study full-time in yeshiva as well. And one of the cornerstones of yeshiva study is that people, mostly men, basically exclusively men, will study these ancient Aramaic legal codes, which are known as the Talmud, which is that in the around the turn of the century and turn of the Common Era, around the turn of the millennium, first millennium, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and around the time of the growth of Christianity, the rabbis decided to write down all of the oral tradition and all of the laws that were passed down to them. And they recorded all of these debates and between them about lots of technical minutia about Jewish law. And so there are literally thousands and thousands of pages of these very esoteric legal debates written in Aramaic that I would spend more time than any human being probably should studying. So I think it's a fair question to ask, how did that impact the person who I am today? And so a few things that come to mind. One is that, anytime I encounter a contract that I spend like way more time than I should, like diving into the legal minutia. I probably could have been a lawyer in a different life. And I think that, one of the things that I've done for the various tech companies is help them with their community standards, which is the essentially legal corpus or the texts that help decide what kind of content gets to stay on these platforms and what kind of content gets taken down. And these are documents that are often like, 50 to 60 pages long, and then they have to be translated into practical guidance to an army of tens of thousands of content moderators that then need to implement that. And not just that, but they need to implement it there's different rules in different geographies and different locales. And so they need to be translated into like different languages and different cultures. So for example, like standards around nudity are very different in France than they are in Saudi Arabia. And so a lot of times I would just spend, like hours upon hours, dozens of hours going through these 60-page documents with a fine-tooth comb, with a sort of metaphorical red pen, just saying like, okay, if, 1/3 of the nipple is showing, and it's this policy, and if 2/3 of the nipple is showing, then it falls under this policy. And, it's not just like, do you take it down, but do you keep it up? But it's like, well, maybe you keep it up, but you don't amplify it. Like you don't put it into someone's news feed, or it doesn't go into the For You tab on TikTok. And so thinking about what should the different policies be on everything from nudity to, drug trafficking and illicit material, to hate speech and bullying and harassment. And so I would say that my, countless hours spent poring over ancient Aramaic legal texts was surprisingly good preparation for helping tech companies write their standards, write their policy standards for social media platforms.
Just following up on that really quickly, like from your experience, what has been the most difficult kind of content to moderate for some of these companies? And for you personally, like, you have a certain belief set in freedom and freedom of speech and those types of things. Is there something in particular that you found difficult, just of a generalized category?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of this a constant balance of tension between freedom of speech, or what's often called in these companies or referred to as autonomy, as like a really important value, and keeping people safe. And the question is like, whose responsibility is it to keep people safe? And there's content that I think is like objectively harmful. And the question is like, if these are consenting adults who are opting in to using this content, like, is it really the company's responsibility to take down content that is harmful, but like grownups can opt into doing harmful things? Like grownups can drink alcohol, even though alcohol is, absolutely proven to take people's lives and to create other sorts of health issues. Adults can smoke cigarettes willingly. They're literally putting poison into their bodies, and like you're allowed to do that as a grown-up in America. And so, there's a separate question obviously about children using these platforms, and technically some of these platforms you can be on there when you're 16 or even as young as 13. And so there's a question But even when it comes to children, there's this question of, is it the platform's responsibility to protect children on the platform, or is it the parents' responsibility to protect children on the platform? And we can go down, a whole conversation about that, because a lot of what I did in these companies is youth safety and youth mental health. But I think that that's kind of like conceptually the challenge of someone like me and the many others like me in these companies who are writing these policies, where it's like, okay, this content is harmful, but like, should people be able to access harmful content? And there is this sort of aphorism in the industry of freedom of speech is not the same thing as freedom of reach, right?
Mm.
In the sense that, like, you should be allowed to say what you want, but you're not entitled to have everything that you say or everything that you post be amplified. And I think there's also a sense of giving people, if you are going to give people, like, give the possibility of people being exposed to harmful content, you also have to empower them with the tools to decide that we don't want to be exposed to that content. And so there's a lot of work being done around creating like dashboards and filters and tools that people can use to curate their own experience. But obviously that often comes in conflict with the business models or optimizing for engagement that drives a lot of the algorithms in these companies.
Yeah, so we're going to come back to sort of ethics and technology, but a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is, careers and what you've learned from the various choices you've made. So, you've now are in the role that everyone would have assumed you would have been in probably about 20 years ago. But, how did you end up going from yeshiva, i.e. Jewish seminary, to not rabbi? And what were tell us a little bit about those first few roles out of religious education. And what was that like, doing things in a secular context, having lived in an almost entirely religious context?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, and it's always like a nice invitation to reflect on these things that I don't get to reflect on that often. I would say that in some ways, this might be surprising to people who don't grow up in the Orthodox world, or at least the corner of the Orthodox world that I grew up in. But in some ways, I got the message as a child that, like, being a rabbi or being a Jewish professional was actually not a very prestigious job, right? Like, there was a sense that, like, you become a rabbi if you can't do anything else, right? Like, it's like, if you can't pass the LSATs, or if you don't get a good score on your essay, oh, all right, fine, like, go become a rabbi. And I don't know if everybody got that message, and maybe there was just something unique about the milieu that I grew up in, but like, definitely there was this sense. I think like what really shifted my trajectory is I I ended up going to Yale as an undergrad, which was like a very huge culture shock for me, coming from this like cloistered Orthodox experience. And I grew up in LA on the West Coast, and even just like being totally removed from like that Northeast prep school kind of elite WASPy cultural environment. But without telling the long convoluted story, I'll say I basically applied to Yale, bet with someone that they bet me that I couldn't get in, and I was just like, you think I can't get into Yale? And then I like applied and somehow got in, and was just like,
so what were the stakes? I gotta know, what did you win other than getting to go to Yale?
It was maybe a bet is not the most. Basically, what happened is, to try and make a very long story short, is that a friend of mine had a cousin who was visiting, who from New York, who went to this very elite New York prep school, and he basically made some very snooty comment about like applying to Ivy League schools, and we obviously could never get into an Ivy League school from the environment that we grew up in, and not going to some elite prep school. And I was basically like, oh, like, is that so? Like, you think I can't get into Yale? And so I just basically applied to prove him wrong. So it wasn't quite a bet, but it was more like a personal vendetta. And then I got in and was like, oh shit, like, I guess I have to go to Yale now.
I think spite is a very underrated emotion. It's the reason you went to Yale. And I would argue it's the real reason that Trump became president, to spite Obama making fun of him at that press club event. So you have leveraged it to totally transform your life. So you get in, then what happens? Sorry for interrupting.
Definitely the culture at Yale, I definitely like imbibed it. Like it was new to me, surrounded by people who had been like careerist strivers for practically their entire lives. Like, that's basically what you have to do to get into Yale. Even you might think like, oh, you get into Yale and you can relax, but like actually then there's this, the rat race just enters like a new chapter.
Mm.
And so all these people were just like constantly angling for like getting in, becoming president of whatever club they were in and getting the top internships and getting into secret societies and all of things that. And just, it was so new to me that on the one hand, I was a bit of an outsider, very much an outsider, and like skeptical and cynical of it. And on the other part of me was just like lapping it up. And I think that I very much internalized, like, if you are to, we were told from the day that we arrived on campus of like, you are being groomed to be a future leader of the world. And so that's what we're expecting of you. And that's what we're positioning you for. And so I kind of believe that as an impressionable 19-year-old. And so I just really got onto this career track of, hey, if I want to be a valuable, worthwhile, serious person in the world, I'm going to go into journalism, and then I'm going to go work in government, and then I'm going to go work in academia and NGO, and all these sort of gold stars on my resume that were equated with self-worth and accomplishment that I picked up in my time there. And I'd say in many ways, the past 20, 25 years for me have been about unlearn those values that I internalized as a teenager.
So let's continue on your path of learning, unlearning. You start off in journalism, right? That's your first,
Right.
and then you move to war.
Yes. Well, I was a little bit in war in journalism too,
Right.
because I spent 2 years as a Middle East correspondent for Newsweek. And so I lived in Egypt and Lebanon, and I spent time in Iraq during the Iraq War and in Syria. So yeah, so I got a little bit of war there. And then after a couple of years of that, I just got totally burnt out from like living out of my suitcase, covering 12 different countries, smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and was like, okay, I need to move back to America, and I want to sleep in my own bed. And I moved to DC, worked for a number of other publications in Washington. I worked at the New Republic, I worked at the Atlantic, and then I had the opportunity to join the Defense Department. And I was reached out to by somebody who worked in the White House, like, what do they call it again? The Office of Political PPO. What does that stand for? Political, I forget, but the office that places political appointees in government positions. And they were looking for somebody to be a speechwriter for Ash Carter, who was then the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he eventually became the Secretary of Defense. And specifically, they wanted someone who, he was actually at that time angling to become the Secretary of Defense, or position himself to become the Secretary of Defense. And so they wanted someone who could help him sort of elevate his profile beyond the, the sort of wonky Pentagon management stuff that he'd been working on. And initially I was just like, I don't want to work in the Pentagon. Like, that's, the War Department. Now it technically is the War Department. But I was like, you know what? Like, this is like so far outside my world. And growing up in the Orthodox Jewish world, I did not have a single friend who joined the U.S. military. I had a number of friends who joined the Israeli military, but nobody. And so I didn't really know anything about the culture other than like the time I had spent in Iraq and places like that. And I was like, generally when I make career decisions, I'm really optimizing for learning. Like, I just kind of have a voracious curiosity. I get bored very quickly. And so I really want, like, I try to make my next job as different as possible from my previous job, but like, it's so that I can learn as much, but as different as possible, still within the realm of feasibility, right? Where so like, I kind of like to say that like every job is like a 50% turn, where there's like 50% overlap that I'm qualified to do and 50% that I'm totally unqualified to do. But that like first 50% is what gets me in the door. And so it was just like, and it was ended up being true. Like, it was just like a totally fascinating cultural experience for me to be surrounded by people from a totally different background, working on issues that were completely new to me. And I really, at the time, actually thought, okay, I'm going to spend a year working in the government, and then I'm going to go back to working in journalism because that's what I wanted to do. And I ended up staying in government for a couple years because it ended up being so fascinating. And I think also because I was so not attached to working in government, that
Mhm.
I didn't really like follow the usual ladder climbing rules. I'm just going to insert myself in as many places as possible and try to do the most interesting stuff in the short time that I'm going to be here. And then, of course, I think there's a lot of emperors not wearing any clothes in the government where there are all these rules about what you can and can't do. And oh, by the way, if you don't follow those rules, you actually get to do really cool things, and you can actually ascend the ladder more than you would if you were following the usual ladder climbing rules.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, for the audience to know, Zvika was my former boss and was sort of in charge of Harrison and I. And I think that's one of the reasons why we got along very well, is that an acknowledgement that, like, people tell you these are the rules, but you don't have to believe them. And when you stop believing them and follow what you authentically think is the right thing to do, not just going off like stealing everything, you can really accomplish amazing things and have great experiences that you can be proud of. Um, Harrison, I don't know if you want to go into the question or if I should
Oh,
continue.
no, no, I was just reflecting on what you said, Zvika, about sort of one of the benefits was not having attachments to this idea of this future career in government that allowed you to flourish. And it really reminded me of sort of that Buddhist approach of like having no attachments in particular is the road to finding your true self and like what you actually want to accomplish and enjoy in life. So I was just reflecting upon that for a moment there. But I think we sort of got to the point where, you were part of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, actually helped found it, right? And I guess now, 10 years on, where does that sit for you in terms of the various impactful things you've done in your career? Do you see that as having the impact you thought it would? What did it go beyond that? Did it change? Like, how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, just, connecting the dots for the listeners, like, I worked at the Defense Department, and then I moved over to the State Department, and I was like, okay, this feels a little more aligned with my values, and then did various things at the State Department, but one of them was working in tech policy and helping the U.S. government think about emerging tech, and then moved out. They sent me out to California. And then to be our ambassador to Silicon Valley. And then when Trump got elected, I was okay, like screw that. I'm not working for the Trump administration. And so then I went to, so I did taught at Stanford and did a couple other things, but then got recruited to work for the World Economic Forum. Frankly, like I was pretty skeptical when the recruiters had reached out to me because like, like I associate the World Economic Forum with, like Davos and like elitism and the 1% and like people who are like looking to like rub shoulders with fancy people, and it was just so not me and so not my vibe. But in my conversations, particularly with Klaus Schwab, who was the founder and sort of visionary, and I forget what his title was, executive chairman of the organization, there was this sense I was pretty upfront with them that I wanted to do the way that they had done things in Geneva was not going to translate into Silicon Valley, and that if they really wanted to create a Silicon Valley office, they had to be not just like hire people with tech expertise, but hire people who were culturally different and being open to things being done differently. For some crazy reason, decided to hire me. And so, implicitly and explicitly sort of signed off on that approach. And it was an incredible experience. I would say it's like one of the most powerful experiences in my career. When else do you get a $10 million budget, access to the Rolodex of the most powerful people in the world, the CEOs and heads of state, and this beautiful campus in the Presidio and an entire infrastructure. And then sort of this blank canvas is like, all right, like I remember like I sat down on day one and they're like, okay, like write the theory of change, and like write the sort of methodology of like what this center is going to do. And for many years working in government and teaching at Stanford, like I had done a lot of work on design thinking and human-centered design and how to apply that to policymaking. And then all of a sudden to have this laboratory where we could actually put that into action with governments, with companies, NGOs, civil society, and to be able to build like the most incredible team to do that. That was a dream job. Like, where does somebody get to do that? Up until that point, I had really only managed teams of like 5 to 7 people. And then all of a sudden being able to manage an organization that went from like 10 people to 30 people to 50 people to 70 people to 100 people to having offices in 13 different countries. Like that was a really cool leadership incubator for me, and learning how to do that work. And as you both observed, constantly being a little bit behind the curve and having to up level at every point and be like, okay, now that we're 30 people, I have to manage differently. And I've never hired that many people in my life, and so a lot of my work was building the team. And I'm obviously not the first person to say that when you're starting an organization, all you really need to do is hire the right people and then get out of the way. And the ability to hire the world leading experts in all of these emerging technology areas, but then also to optimize for like good people. Like there were a lot of really, really smart people who applied to work at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, super accomplished, amazing resumes, who are also like total assholes or just D-bags, and like, we had a rule, right? Like no D-bags at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it was really funny. I remember, I don't know if you guys remember this, or I don't even remember how publicly I talked about this, but there was a finalist for a role at the center for a leadership role who we were getting ready to hire. Like they were very, very impressive. And then our sort of secretary, administrative assistant, the woman who sat at the front door, she pulled me aside and was just like, hey, I don't know whether I should say anything, but like this woman was like incredibly rude and condescending and like totally inappropriate. And I was just like, done. Like we're definitely not hiring her, And so it was just really cool to be able to build a team of smart, capable, accomplished people who are also just good people, which is just so rare in the tech world and beyond. And so it really felt like a family, and being in a place where we could just sort of grow the culture from scratch and design it together was just such an incredible experience.
I'll admit, it's actually, probably before COVID happened, like that period before COVID, the favorite job that I've had so far, where I wasn't being shot at. And getting to work with both of you is a big part of that. I have two connected questions. Actually, the first one is for both of you. So Harrison, I'm going to put you on the spot as well. And part of the idea behind it was what I would call sort of social corporatism, right? That we should look to large companies as a potential source of leadership for solving global challenges like climate change. And a lot has happened since the three of us left the forum. And I'm curious, still believe in that potential, or sort of how your understanding of the positive social role that large companies can play has changed. I'll start with Zvika, and then Harrison, I want to hear what you think. And then I'll answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And, in many ways, I sort of continued in that world of corporate, what did you call it? Not social corporatism. Not corporate socialism. It's a different thing. Though you may have some familiarity with that being in New York, near New York these days. I think that it's not a question of whether companies can or should. To me, it's a question of like, they must, in the sense that like companies have an outsized influence on the world. And I think particularly in the tech sphere, these companies are more powerful than most governments, and arguably more powerful than all governments. And most/all governments have essentially abdicated their responsibility to regulate or rein in these companies, right? I mean, like we haven't seen meaningful technology regulation really basically ever, or definitely it's not since the 90s in this country. We were starting to see some really interesting things happening at the state level. And then the Trump administration comes out with an executive order that says, oh, no, actually, we can't regulate tech you're not allowed to regulate tech at the state level, right? So it's
which is quite unpopular. I mean, it's
totally,
interesting,
right?
That not good politics, but
it's just funny that Republicans who are all about federalism and leave it to the states are just like, oh, actually, we don't care about that anymore. And so I think that like at the end of the day, if government is not going to come in and restrain these tech companies, like they have to do it themselves. Now, I don't think that government should give up doing this, or that we should give up our pressure on government or our expectation that government will do this. Like government absolutely does need to. And there are some bright spots in terms of attorneys general,
Hmm.
in the 50 states that are suing Meta and TikTok and some other companies now around youth mental health. Like that actually feels potentially really impactful in the way that any legislation or regulation is not forthcoming on these things. And so I think that companies absolutely must rein in their own excesses and think about the impact of their technologies. Now, the question is, can they be trusted to do so is a more complicated question, but whether they can be trusted to or not, like no one else is doing it. My experience working in a number of social media companies on social corporatism, for lack of a better word, is that there is a business case for it, right? You can't think of it as like, oh, be a good corporate citizen. You can't think about it. You have to think about how does this actually tie to your bottom line? And
Hmm.
there's, I think, a number of ways that I found effective ways to advocate for that. But I think if it's all about just kind of like appealing to the better angels of the people who are in positions of power, that's not going to lead to any meaningful oversight or curbing of these excesses.
Yeah.
How about you,
Yeah.
Harrison? What do you think?
No, I mean, I agree quite a lot with what you were saying. I think where I've been most challenged in the way I've sort of seen my like role when I was at the forum and engaged in this world, but then also today is in the way that sort of the make your mark economy or like the short-term thinking has often driven decision making now in like global aid, right? For example. And so you have individuals who take over leadership roles who are close with corporations that are willing to make large donations or willing to invest and support meaningful projects. But as soon as that sort of shiny object isn't shiny anymore, right? Delivery drones for aid or, AI in application for urban planning, things like that. As soon as it becomes sort of not the cool thing anymore, you see a lot less attention to it and that those vast amounts of money go elsewhere or aren't used in effective ways. And so perhaps in drones, instead of a drone logistic network that was proposed and could be implemented and evolve and make meaningful difference in Tanzania, that money leaves. And instead of having roads and bridges that could have been developed and still would be there, the technology innovation evaporates and those people are left actually in the same or worse conditions because they can no longer depend on that 10-year plan. And so I think sometimes, I guess what I'm saying is short term economics, I think, are starting to corrupt international projects in a way that sort of mirrors the corporate turnover that I've seen that I think is disillusioning to me personally. But I guess that's the only thing I would add to what you said, because I think you said it
Yeah.
much better than I would have.
I'll be short and just say I do think corporations have incredible power and influence, so it is good to try and organize and influence them. Just we shouldn't expect them to have much courage, right?
Hmm.
When the broad culture aligns with sort of liberal progressive values, they will do things in alignment with that. And when the broad culture moves towards conservative, anti-immigrant protectionist sentiment, then they'll move along with that. So they're powerful entities, and occasionally you can have a leader with courage, but we have to shape them through the broader culture and through the politics. And then that's what points them in the direction where the power that they have is most likely to be useful. Going a little bit in that direction, I want to ask you, Zvika, a question that I haven't really heard framed elsewhere, which was at the forum, we worked on the premise that the future will be designed, not determined. We can control how this is deployed. But given the vast amounts of capital needed to create AI in the way that we're thinking about, do you still believe that? Or does it have to come out in this hyper capitalistic way where, even the CEO of Anthropic, who I would take as the most safety minded of the major AI lab CEOs, is saying we have to take money from people in the Middle East who have values that we don't align with just because we need that much money to build all of this out. So, you know, how much are we still in control and how much are there sort of just economic requirements or competitive factors that mean that it's going to be deployed in a certain way?
I would say it's the latter. Like, I think that people, at the end of the day, businesses actually have a legal responsibility to maximize profit for their shareholders, right?
Hmm.
And even if there wasn't that legal responsibility, there's the capitalistic momentum is just too strong. There are some AI companies that I think are thinking more or less about these things. But I think particularly when it comes to AI, there's just so much that we don't know. There's like very concrete harms that we're seeing, like helping people commit suicide, or encouraging people to to murder people, or helping people sort of delve into psychosis. There's obviously like lots of misinformation on AI and bias in AI, but like there's also just these like really foundational questions about like how is AI going to be changing society and how we relate to one another. There's obviously like huge questions around job dislocation. I don't think anybody in these companies is thinking about these things. I think there's just short-termism of like AI is valuable. These virtual assistants or virtual, chatbots or whatever agentic AI or whatever you want to call it, like they are good, right? And making them as powerful as possible is good, right? And it kind of reminds me a little bit of the ethos around social media, where there was the positive use cases were so clear that anyone could kind of bury their head in the sand around the negative use cases, where I'm going to do whatever I can to develop this product, not because I'm like a money grubbing Scrooge McDuck capitalist, right? I'm doing it because I have this mission. Like, we're connecting the world. We're giving voice to the voiceless. We're helping spur democracy in Egypt, and and whatnot. And you can kind of hide behind that. And I think with AI, like, it is doing a lot of awesome things right now in the world. And so I think people can sort of say this is why we're driving it. But I think it sort of really obscures the fact that it's really about money and profit. And I think there's this sort of competitive sprint right now between the major AI companies. Every time there's a new model released, it sends frantic shockwaves in the other three major AI companies, and they're just like frantically racing, and nobody's stopping to be like, wait, like what kind of world are we creating? And AI is just so damn useful that it's not going to stop anytime soon. And so I think it's interesting for me being in like a little bit more of like a spiritual position right now, where I still work for tech companies. And so I'm still thinking about things, like some of the more practical things about how do we make these products safer. But I am also taking a step back and thinking about, just like the massive, massive growth in companion bots and people turning to AI for therapy, and maybe putting you out of business soon, Timothy, people turning to AI for religious and spiritual guidance, and maybe putting me out of business soon. I was looking at some of the statistics around like the number of people that turn to AI for romantic relationships. And I just finished listening to this great podcast called Flesh and Code. I don't know if you've heard of it, which is all about people who fall in love with chatbots, and they're not weird, crazy freaks. Like, they're just normal people, and being in love with a chatbot is just way easier than being in love with a human being. And you would be shocked to look at the numbers of people who are using these platforms, because this is a social revolution. Like, I think we're going to look at this akin to the printing press moment in completely transforming human history. And I don't think the people at the helm of these AI companies are thinking about that.
So let's talk a little bit about your transition to what you're doing now. How did you decide that you should become a rabbi, which I guess you'd been told before was the lowest form of work you could possibly engage in? And what has it been like turning your attention to more spiritual matters?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd always been religious, spiritual, and, even though I kind of left the sort of cloistered shtetl confines of my little Orthodox bubble, I still, like, religion remained very important to me, and I was still, like, traditionally observant in many ways. And the challenge was that I found that even though the religion and the spirituality might have resonated with me, like culturally, I just felt very, very alienated. A lot of people in that world are very culturally conservative. And so I just wasn't really finding places out in the world where I could practice the kind of deep spiritual practice that I had grown up practicing and really valued, but then be surrounded with people who I actually liked or who sort of aligned with me on a cultural perspective, on a values perspective, and just socially. And so I ended up in my and 30s, like basically creating a lot of my own spiritual spaces. And because I grew up Orthodox, I had a lot, too much knowledge and education around how to do that. And so I felt very empowered to create my own spaces. And so whether it was like in my living room or in my backyard or out in the forest or wherever, I'm going to create, like, what I want doesn't exist. I don't really feel like I belong in any places that currently exist. And so I'm going to create my own place for myself. And like, people are showing up and there are other people who want this too. And I think like the big shift for me is that about 10 years ago, I joined the leadership of the Jewish camp at Burning Man called Milk and Honey, where we would put on these massive Shabbat prayer services for like thousands of people. And it was, first of all, just so fun to plan those prayer services, which were these like cool fusion of deeply authentic, spiritual, like using traditional liturgy and melodies and rituals, and then weaving them in with sort of playfulness and whimsy. And you're at Burning Man and people are half naked and walking around in like tutus, and bringing that kind of whimsy and playfulness and bringing in pop culture and embodiment and dance and fun and joy. And it was so fun to kind of use the knowledge that I had built through my childhood to kind of weave in that creative way. But then people would line up for hours after that prayer service and just be weeping to line up to talk to me and just be weeping, just saying like, this is the first spiritual experience I've ever had. This is the first Jewish experience I've had since my bar mitzvah, since being a kid. This is the first time that prayers have ever resonated with me. Thank you, Rabbi. And I'm like, whoa, like, I'm not a rabbi. And they're like, where can I get this? I come every year. This is my one time a year where I do anything spiritual. Where can I get this out in the world? And I was like, honestly, like nowhere. Like there isn't anything like this out in the world. And then like at a certain point, I was just like every year, this experience I have at Burning Man is like the highlight of my year. I look forward to it so deeply. And I do have this unique gift that I was given as a child, like of deep Jewish knowledge. I'm like, there are clearly people out in the world who are looking for something and don't have access to it. And I can be that bridge for people. And so when I was working at Meta, totally burnt out after 2 years. I had a couple of crises in my personal life. The pace at Meta was just relentless. I mean, it was just so hard driving. And I'm like, I can't handle these personal crises that I'm dealing with and being an executive at this tech company. And so I left this spiritual community here in Berkeley that is like super cool. Their spiritual leaders retired. A bunch of people started reaching out to me being like, hey, you would be amazing for this job. You should apply. I was like, no. I'm going to work in tech. I don't want to work in a synagogue. Like synagogues are where like Judaism goes to die. Nobody wants to go to a synagogue. I don't want to deal with fundraising and board politics. But then like I am technically unemployed right now, and this is a really cool community. And so I was like, able to convince that tech company to let me work half-time instead of full-time. And so I worked half-time as a spiritual leader and half-time at this tech company. And that's what I've been doing for the past 4 years, is working like half-time in tech and half-time as a spiritual leader of this really cool, fun, amazing community that's now like overrun with burners because all the people who come to Shabbat at Burning Man were like, oh my God, like now I can come every week. And so it's been pretty awesome.
Well, since you are a rabbi, we're going to do a little series called What's Up with Jews and got 3 questions in the series, and then Harrison's going to close us out with a few important questions and then bring us home. So first question is, what's up with Jews and AI? And just to set a little bit of context, the first computer and a lot of the principles for AI were created by John von Neumann, Hungarian Jew. The MIT Computer Science and AI Lab was created by Marvin Minsky, a Jew. First AI chatbot, Eliza, Jofus Weizenbaum. First modern AI model, AlexNet, was created by Alek Krasinski in collaboration with Ilya Sutskever, both Jews. Ilya would go on to co-found OpenAI with fellow Jew Sam Altman. And then 2 of the 5 major labs were founded by Jews. So Sam Altman, we've got Sergey Brin at Google, and then we've got Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. So
And don't
why are
and
Jews,
don't forget our favorite Mark Benioff at Salesforce.
but why are Jews so overrepresented in the field of AI?
Well, we're treading very close to the world of Elders of Zion conspiracy theory world. But I mean, in reality, you can say that about a lot of industries, and I think that going back to what we were talking about earlier about my own journey into the world of careerism and professional success, I think there is a sort of certain striving that is really common in Jewish communities. We've been this kind of stateless, persecuted, wandering people for so many generations, for arguably much of Jewish history. And there is this sense of we need to prove ourselves. And the way that we belong is by achieving professional success. The world of technology is just one arena where that manifests. If I'm wanting to, if we're wanting to get a little bit more theological or spiritual, I do think Jews have a tendency of wanting to question conventional wisdom. If you open up the Talmud, it's all about arguing and trying to push the contours of debate. And so I think that there is this sort of pugnaciousness, iconoclastic ethos within Judaism that you actually see in a lot of those names of people that were just represented. And I will say that there was this very interesting interview between Tucker Carlson and Sam Altman a couple months ago, where Tucker Carlson asked Sam Altman, do you think AI is God? And Sam Altman said, no. And then Tucker Carlson was like, well, do you believe in God? And Sam Altman was like, yes. And he's like, well, what, what kind of God do you believe in? He's like, well, Jewish. And so I believe in a Jewish version of God. And Tucker Carlson is very much trying to push almost a Christian conception of God. Well, do you believe in a God that does this? And do you believe in a God that does that? And Sam Altman, I think to his credit, was basically yeah, in Judaism, that's not really how we see God. And God is more around this infinite mystery and this sort of unknowingness of the secrets of the universe. And I think that there is a way in which that conception of God, which is, I think, I would say uniquely Jewish, but I think sort of differs from maybe more of a Christian conception of God, might impact the way that these leaders are thinking about these challenges around AI.
So this actually leads to my next question, which was, what is up with Jews and God? Because you gave a really interesting podcast interview about what is it like to believe in God. I listened to it with my son, actually. And the conception that you gave is that, in a sense, God is all that was, all that is, and all that will be. But I would say that's very different from the God that appears in the Torah, and that this isn't unique to you. A lot of Jews I know do not have a conception of God that is similar to what is in the stories of the Hebrew Bible, and that even a lot of rabbis, or at least Reform rabbis, which is where I spend more time, don't believe in a God that came down and handed tablets to Moses, or that really relates to the mitzvot or the things that are in the Torah. So why is it that the God that so many Jews seem to conceive of does not seem very tethered to the Jewish texts?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the hallmarks of Judaism is that there's no such thing as Judaism. There's Judaisms, right? There's many different Judaisms that exist. Same thing with Christianity, obviously, and probably true of any religion. And that Judaism, there, at this point in history, there are certainly many different Judaisms, but also throughout history, there have been many different Judaisms. Some people have an agenda to try to demonstrate that actually Judaism has been one thing and, coincidentally, their thing throughout Jewish history. And so I think that my conception of Judaism, which I think is very deeply grounded in traditional texts, in my conception of God, which is very grounded in traditional texts, certainly in mystical texts, is very authentically Jewish expression. And some people see it as more like this kind of idea of God is not separate from us, and God is not this like entity, this old man in the sky sitting on a throne, but is actually like the sum total of all of existence is God. Some people might see that as like more like a Buddhist or Eastern conception, but it's actually like deeply resonant in Judaism for thousands of years. But I also, have the intellectual honesty to say that it's not the only conception of God in Judaism, and there's been lots of different conceptions of God. And I think the one thing that I think you have to agree on is that like God is inherently unknowable, right? Like that is something that is consistent across Judaism. And so anyone who says God is blank is wrong, or at the very least incomplete. And if you want to know more about this topic, you can read my forthcoming book, The God You Don't Believe in: Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living, Loving, and Letting Go. And so look at your local bookstore in fall 2027 for my full answer to that question.
You heard it here first. Awesome.
Totally. Yes. This is the premiere.
That's fantastic. I really will be reading that and so excited. And the last question, which unfortunately is a little bit heavy, but then Harrison will bring us back up. I feel an obligation to ask this is, what's up with Jews and Gaza? And let me frame that question. I don't mean that we're going to have a conversation about Middle East politics or about the morality of what happened, but within the context of the Jewish community, how do you manage the fact there are many Jews who believe what happened there was deeply immoral on the part of the Jewish state and that there was a genocide committed? Other people feel that it was a righteous response to people who were attacking the Jewish community. And I imagine that especially where you are in the Bay Area, you have a congregation that includes people with both perspectives. So how do you manage people who feel very impassioned potentially on different sides of this? And what do you think is going to happen to the Jewish community around this, which I think is divided in a way that it has not been, certainly for decades, if not potentially centuries? Or maybe you don't agree with the framing of that, but how do you
No,
think
I
about
absolutely agree with the framing, and it's something I spend an inordinate amount of my time grappling with, given that I'm the rabbi of a synagogue in Berkeley, perhaps the most liberal city in the country. And I think that like we are seeing absolutely what I would describe as a schism within the Jewish community around this issue. I mean, it really feels like different Jews and different Jewish communities are living in completely different worlds and are practicing completely different religions based on how they're reacting to this. And I think for so many years, Zionism has been, equated, has been sort of like a unquestioned sort of core component of Jewish identity. And frankly, I found that to be problematic, not necessarily because I'm anti-Zionist or have any, don't think Israel should exist, but I think that like nationalism is a very weak foundation for personal identity. And I think that to have, Jews in America or in any other country build their identity on what's happening in a country that is not only thousands of miles away and culturally very different, but they have no say in what actually happens in that country, right? And I think that we're seeing the organized Jewish community in America made a bet over the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years to ground American Jewish identity in Zionism, like the massive investment in birthright and, and other things like that. It was a bet. And I think that bet was made at a time when Israel and America were seen as very aligned culturally and on a values perspective, and it felt like a safe bet. And now we're seeing the perils of that, where all of a sudden you have a government that is not accountable to American Jews, doing things that a lot of American Jews disagree with. And I think that you're seeing a lot of communities kind of break down and split based on this. And people are saying like, wow, this actually is like a very thin thing to base our identity on. And like what is a Judaism that is like deeply rich and meaningful and cultural and spiritual and like not ethno-nationalist. And so I think, I have a deep connection to Israel My family is like 8th generation Jerusalemites. My dad lives there. 3 of my brothers live there. I studied in yeshiva there. I've lived there many times on and off through my life. I've probably been there 30 times. But I also like have deep qualms about what's happening there. And I definitely, and I'm holding together a community of people who span the whole spectrum of how they feel about that. And just to kind of more directly answer your question, like what is sad about one of the things that's sad about this current environment is that so many Jewish communities are siloing or sort of self-sorting into you're either Zionist or you're anti-Zionist. And we've lost our ability to be in community with people who we disagree with or people who we have different perspectives. And I think that that's true in Jewish communities. And I think it's true in America. We're definitely seeing like a self-sorting, MAGA, Republican, Democrat, progressive, conservative, and like I think it's leading to the extreme polarization in our politics in our country. And so I'm trying to hold together a community where we say that being in community with people you disagree with is a spiritual practice. That is actually just as important as keeping Shabbat and keeping kosher and praying. Like that's a muscle that we need to work, and it's hard. That's why it's called a spiritual practice, because it's hard. And so like I hope that more communities can sort of do that. But sadly, I think that we're just seeing the opposite, like people moving further and further away from each other.
Well, thank you, Zvika, for that really insightful answer. And I think I've really appreciated just the conversation with you today. I realize, we're running short on time. Everybody's got to get back to their other various parts of their life. But I did have 2 questions for you. One, we asked to everyone, and I'll get to that last. But the main one that I think is the most important question that will be asked in this podcast is, growing up, you were a Dodger fan, right?
Yes.
And now you live in Berkeley. You have to be part of that community. You've lived a long time in the tech industry. Are you now a Giants fan?
Well, it's funny because I actually had like a little bit of like a secret crush on the A's when I was growing up. I was very into like, Ricky Henderson, I had his like little poster in my bedroom. But I have like a very complicated relationship to Bay Area sports because not only was I Dodgers fan growing up, but I was a Raiders fan growing up. And I actually, almost every picture you see of me as a kid, I'm wearing a Raiders sweatshirt. And then the Raiders broke my heart as a kid because they moved to Oakland. And then finally when I moved to Oakland, I just had these or Berkeley, right next to Oakland, I had these very complicated feelings towards the Raiders. I was like, okay, you were my like first love. And like now maybe you were just kind of waiting for me to come back. And so I started to open up my heart to the Raiders, and then they did it to me again. They broke my heart again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I know growing up in the 90s, the Dodgers broke hearts, were terrible, and now we're back-to-back champions. So, it's okay. I just have to say that now every podcast. So anyway, it's been fantastic. Well, this podcast is about reconnecting with the colleagues and friends and, trying to decide who falls into what category. And, I guess, would you say that after all of this, that we can call ourselves technically friends or technically colleagues?
I would say absolutely friends. And it's just so good to victory. I would say that it's just so good to connect with you guys. And like, as I was saying, like, I just look back so fondly at the time that we spent together and that we were able to create this workplace, like where I think even when we were colleagues, we were also technically friends. Like I really felt that way. And whether it was, going on long runs over the Golden Gate Bridge or, Taco Tuesdays, or just, I also think there was some kind of like, friends in the trenches. Like we definitely had to go to battle a lot together against the forces of evil. There's a certain bonding component to that. And so it's just so awesome to reconnect with you guys. And anytime you're in the Bay Area, would love to hang out.
Thank you so much, Zvika. And Timothy, thank you for the research you did for this podcast, because my voice is shot and I really appreciate it.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.